Well, welcome, good evening, and thanks for coming to help us celebrate 10 years in what you're experiencing as a remarkable building. And over the course of tonight, we'll hear a bit more about how this building was made, but also about the making of this building through the last 10 years of conversations, not just of choreographers, but of intersections across the arts, and none more perhaps fundamental than the intersection of dance and architecture, movement and space. And we'll hear from our two guests, they're not guests, our two, you guys are guests in this place. The two instigators of this incredible building, Siobhan Davies and Sarah Wigglesworth. Some 20 years conversations between them emerged, and over a decade, the planning and the thought and the labor to produce this building came about. So we'll hear some of their initial thoughts and some reflections, I think, about what it means to design a space for people, to design a space for conversation, possibility, imagination, and how those emerge not just in the actions of the building, but its physical constitution. So just to briefly introduce, although these two do not need introduction, I'm sure, but they warrant it. So we have Siobhan Davies, who's artistic director here at Siobhan Davies Studios. She's a dancer with the London Contemporary Dance Theatre during the 70s, becoming one of its leading choreographers. In 1982, alongside others, she created Second Stride. She went on to get the first Fulbright scholarship for a choreographer in 1986, and in 1988 founded Siobhan Davies Dance. She's won multiple awards, including the Laurence Olivier Award for Outstanding Achievement in Dance, was named a CBE in 2002. And in 2006, she opened this building, Siobhan Davies Studios. And from then, this building and its work and her thoughts started to amplify her interest in conversations between choreography, movement, and the multiple other visual and performing arts. So alongside the collaborations and investigations in movement, like 2013-14 Table of Contents, she's also created 2 films with David Hinton, All This Can Happen in 2012, and Running Tongue, currently screening this year. So, Siobhan Davies. Sarah Wigglesworth is an award-winning architect with a reputation and interest in ecological buildings and sustainability, in alternative materials. She's professor of architecture at Sheffield University, and at that university in 2002, she founded the PhD in Practice program, which allows advanced students in architecture to submit their research through their practice, drawing, architecture, and built work, not just in writing. She was awarded an MBE in 2004 and also appointed very distinguished Royal Designer of Industry in 2012, which I think is wonderful. Recently, her studio's Deborah House is up for a New London Architecture Award, and this building won a RIBA Award in 2006, among many other of her studio's work. So that's Sarah Wigglesworth, and we're very pleased to have them both here to talk about this. So tonight, we're going to have a conversation. There'll be a bit of history, perhaps, to start with, to invite us into where we're sitting today. A former school, there had been a fire. So what you see here is a radical transformation, and maybe when you came in, you saw some of the images of the building in process from that moment to now. But I'd like to maybe start with a word or two about what it was like the first moment you walked into this building as a space of possibility, as a space of imagination, and the first conversations of this building you had together.
Do you want me to begin?
Go.
Sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, my own memories were partly sort of elation, like this blank canvas, if you like, was there for us to sort of play with. But also, you've got to bear in mind, by the time we found this building, or you found this building, we'd done 2 projects for you already to try and find a dance studio that would work for you, and they both failed for various reasons. So there's always a sort of point of trepidation where you're thinking, God, maybe this one is going to be another wasted effort as well. But actually, I mean, in a way, all of that work that we did over those years, probably 5 years really getting there, was really work that you put in the bank, capital in the bank, because they're learning exercises and actually you're testing something on the way and trying to find the right solution so that when we came to this building, actually there was a lot of baggage that was dumped already. But I mean, it was in a filthy state, wasn't it? It was really, really grotty and cheap, you know, going cheap, but in a very, very poor condition, riddled with asbestos. I mean, the roofs were leaking, there were pigeons everywhere. It was really vile. So it's, I mean, as an architect, you can always see the potential, but for a potential client, it's like, it's very hard to enthuse them.
So is there a lot of convincing being done?
Not really.
I do remember a moment in which I had this deeply enthusiastic friend by the side of me going, yes, yes. And all I could see was the crumble, the fire, the damp, pigeons, and yeah, there was just this, I just looked astounded at her enthusiasm. And at that moment, thank God it was there.
You can see some of the pictures, actually. It was in a state, yeah.
And it was a former school. Was that its previous life?
There it is.
Yeah.
There it is.
So this building sits in the playground of the primary school, which is still out there and there. And it's, I mean, that school is a listed building, and it's actually one of the early board schools. Basically, they're called the board schools because they were set up after the Board of Education was founded in the middle of the 19th century. And so a whole raft of buildings were built at that era, which is quite similar to this arts and crafts. And this annex was built actually as a science classroom, I think. But it's actually, if you look at it carefully, it's a building in two halves with a bit of glue in between, which is where the staircase is. And they're built at different times, actually. So this is the oldest bit of the building there, with the gable roof, with the amazing roof trusses, and it had a wooden floor, didn't it? And then there was another bit which was built later, you can see it there, which had concrete floors. So there were very different, I mean, in the intervening period between these two, there were slightly different levels, slightly different plan forms, etc., shapes and depths and so on. And of course they were built as discrete elements with this sort of bit in the middle, and the trick was to try and bring them together as one whole building. And actually the determining factor, you can see the two different roof types there with this slot in the middle, which is what contained the staircase, was that the only place the studio could go was on the roof, because it was the only place we could get a flat plane, which again you see there, which could straddle between both halves. And that was the size we needed, precisely the size we needed for Sue to do her work, because it's the size approximately of a typical stage or something.
Well, at that time, I thought we should, not only for our own practice, but for other people's practice, have the size of a goodish stage, like Sadler's Wells. Of course, now I don't work in theatres, so it doesn't, not quite as relevant. But it is relevant in the sense that, in one way, I find this a remarkable space on any terms, on any terms whereby work can be made and seen. And there's a sort of equality about, as you make the work, it is also seen. Somehow there isn't a separation. Both are possible at the same time. And I wouldn't have known it at the time, but Sarah has made a space like that, and that's extraordinary.
It's interesting, you're making me in that statement think of kind of foreground and background, which maybe parallels also the kind of foreground and background of the historic building, the new spaces, the space in the middle that intersects them, and this kind of, this playing with the time of performance and display and practice and experiment, the time of the historic and the contemporary as a particular site of possibility. Is that fair to say?
I'm looking at Sarah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the challenge for creating this space was that it was a place of work. I mean, essentially, it's a sort of everyday place where people come in at 9, they do their classes, and then they go home, But at the same time, it had to be, and so at that level, it had to be, inspirational and extremely well lit, and for people to be able to hear properly and work together and all of that. But at another level, it also wanted to be a place of performance, not formally, as in a proscenium, but a place where people like you could come and, you know, we could have a thing like this. And so at one level, it wanted to be very foregrounded in this inspirational space, but at another level, very background. In other words, you don't want to be in the way while the bodies are moving and there's something going on in it, and it needs to kind of focus on people. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for an architect, how to make something which is, you know, both in your face but also background. I mean, it's a tension, but it's a very nice tension to have to play with, actually.
I'm wondering whether, I've just thought this now, there's, as a practicing dance artist, you are also dealing with foreground and background. There are times in which you are privately at work trying to find out what a movement is, what an expression is, what a relationship to your subject or other people or whatever else. So you are, at that moment, in the inward circle of a structure. But if you are not very careful at that moment, you have to constantly be able to reverse it to know that you are going to then perform this or communicate that with other people. So if you go down too much of one spiral, you dip away from the very existence you're meant to be having. If you go too far the other way, your material is not necessarily grounded within you. So I find this such a demonstration of that. It is the most exquisite. I mean, if you think of the detail that goes into every single one of those wooden boards up there, if you look up, there are very few which are exactly the same size. There are very few which have the same torque and twist in them. There are very few that have the same, I mean, they all have the same grain, but their grain is slightly different. Their plane is different. So each one of those is, to me, like some kind of individual thought, individual action. And yet combined, they make this, you know, arc, these arcs that one can live within, these rhythms that one can live within. So from the small to the large, everything about this room works extraordinarily.
And what was the thinking about these? Was it just about light? Was it about the aesthetics of rhythm and curve and movement? Because when you walk in, it's one of the first things everyone turns up. It's foregrounded, it's there. But very quickly, because of the quality of the materials and the light, it allows you to enter into a space of your own thought and creativity.
Yeah, well, why is it the way it is?
You told me it was like a cake.
Yes.
She said what?
She said it was, I loved it. I had no idea. There I was being intellectual and thoughtful and all of that kind of stuff. And then Sarah said, oh, it's like a cake.
Well, you see, it's contained within the walls of the building, and it felt like a kind of loaf of bread that had just risen above the walls that contained it. And that's one really
Just
sort of
love
very
that.
banal metaphor. But I mean, there are all sorts of reasons the way that it is. But I mean, when we were working on it and we were trying to think, you know, what can this roof be like? And it needed to be kind of minimum parameters of 5 meters high. But, you know, we made lots and lots of models, didn't we?
We
of
did.
how could this roof be? And some of them were very boring and banal and just boxes, and others were more exuberant and weird and like all over the place. And then suddenly we just hit on this idea of it could be these ribbons. And we presented all of them to Sue, and of course she picked this one.
The difficult one.
Definitely right about that one. I mean, we were kind of, I think, half hoping she would choose it because it was probably the best solution, and half dreading it because we knew it was going to be the most complicated and difficult to realize. But I mean, always up for a technical challenge. So yeah. And actually, I mean, the way it's worked out is that it's actually a very, very simple solution, which is what was nicest about it. In the refinement of the project, you know, it's 5 ribbons, they're all identical, but the 2 sides of each of these curves are not the same. And each ribbon, therefore, is twisted by 180 degrees. So you get a flip, flop, flip, flop, flip, and there's a rhythm to it. And that's why you get different spandrel panels opening up between how these arches work adjacently. And it just makes a very nice sort of symmetrical rhythm. And that's very appropriate because if dance and so forth is not about rhythm, it's about nothing. So, and also I'm really struck sitting here actually, I haven't really thought about this ever before, but what's sort of inscribed in this roof is also the original division of the building, which is you've got these two wider bits, which are those two, and then you've got a middle bit. And so you can read them as one, or you can read them as two, three bits. Yeah, exactly. There you go, you can see sort of, so it's a 2 widths wide, 1, and then 2. So it's a 2, 1, 2 arrangement. So, you know, there's a lot, actually you have, you know, it kind of accepts the original logic of the building, and yet it does something really different as well.
And sorry, I'm overly excited because I'm remembering everything, but one of the many preparatory conversations we had about the building, we tried to swap information about what mattered to us from our own materials and own skills. And so I wanted to hear, and I tried to read more about, you know, what it means to design a space, which is an extraordinary concept in itself if you take it apart. But I was so grateful when Sarah and her team would take time to listen to ideas about weight, gravity, twist, torque, the materials of the body. I mean, we have a huge amount of materials in our body, from bone to muscle to skin to hair to blood to brain to mush. You know, it's an enormous variety. And again, whether or not that was a direct conversation with Sarah, the celebration of seeing all these materials as you walk from literally from one corner to another is for me a celebration of the diversity of the materials that we have to work and not always pull together. We can treat them as different things in and of themselves, because then that's what makes us celebrate that complexity. So the building and a sense of the body, and I think that's why all dance artists who I think have ever worked in here normally at some point turn around to me and go, my God, this building it is natural to us. It is both natural and unorthodox, and in its unorthodoxy allows us to think afresh all the time.
Something else I'd say as well is, I mean, I think one of the themes that we got quite interested in while we were designing this building was we were looking for metaphors about dance. Not that we were terribly well up on dance at all, but anyway, we quite enjoyed one aspect of this roof, which is to do with this idea of trying to sort of defy gravity and defy and try and capture weightlessness in some fashion. So this idea of a kind of ribbon which had been almost thrown in the air and which had then sort of stuck became something which we found quite enjoyable, and that but there is a sort of grounding to it, and actually the grounding is lent by the floor. And the floor, I think, I mean, you're seeing these two materials, it's the same, but generally your floor is covered in rubber, vinyl, something like that,
yeah.
Which is what the dancers work on. And actually, I began to think that there's something very privileged then about the floor in this arrangement, because the walls and the roof are all the same material, so they're one. There's no distinction between them, and yet so the floor's different, and actually the floor's important in your work because everybody limbers up and starts the day by lying horizontally.
And looking up.
Exactly, but the point at which you are ready to work is when you become vertical, because you've done your exercises. So it's that move from the horizon to the verticality which says you're a dancer today, you know, now I'm ready to start. And I think that's really important about this place, because actually that is a difference. Anyway.
There's something about taking on from the exhibition that you have going on here, which is on gesture. And I think there's something you've both just mentioned about perhaps a difference in that word from an architectural gesture, which might be one about the materiality of the horizontal to the vertical, about rhythm through consistency. Rather than perhaps rhythm of difference or the like. And I wonder if we might use the building to reflect what's an architectural gesture. You could speak about this building itself, or we could think of buildings in general and what you might have learned from this building in its life. And then different gesture in movement, and how those might come together in space. So is there an architectural gesture? Is this an architectural gesture?
Well, it probably is, but actually I don't really like the idea of an architectural gesture because, I mean, its connotations tend to be that you're making a kind of big statement, or you're posturing a little bit, you know. So forgive me if this is a posturing event, but I suppose I'm actually more interested in how architecture orchestrates everyday gesture. In other words, in how it's playing with your understanding about received behavior or daily ritualized behavior that you almost carry out unconsciously or by rote, and perhaps changes that a little bit. In other words, makes you stop and think, or makes you question, how am I meant to behave, or am I allowed to go here, or all of those things. You know, so it's taking the everyday gesture and it's perhaps adjusting it in a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I don't know whether this building does that, but I think that's a kind of primary interest of mine in anything that I'm doing. So perhaps when you walk in here, I mean, I think there's something interesting about this building in terms of its scale, actually, because the scale of this building is not very big. It's like a large house, actually, and yet it's a kind of cultural building. So immediately you're thinking, you know, what is it? Where am I? How am I expected to behave, etc. Where do I go? You know, who do I talk to, etc. And all of those things I think are really, really interesting about this building. Even the echoes of, it used to be a school, how is it not a school anymore? You know, so you've got echoes of your received behavior about walking into a place with glazed tiles and brickwork and, you know, big windows that you can't reach and things like that. You know, it's all that stuff that we carry in us about memory of place. And you're being asked to think again about that, which I think is really interesting.
So it's a process of looking again at the everyday, at the ritual of the everyday.
And helping you to rethink that perhaps, or readjusting your expectations about what that might be in a new context. And that's done through lived experience. You know, it's about constantly challenging the ways that you might think it's right to behave, or what you do appropriately in this place.
You know, it sounds like ways that you have spoken, or I've heard you speak, about choreography or movement, or the fact that all of us are moving in constant movement, and that not a lot of us get the time to think carefully about what that is, or have a second glance, or being asked to look again at a process of movement in the everyday.
Yeah,
is it analogous, or is it slightly different?
I can start talking about where I've come from in the last few years. I heard a radio program. It's a long time ago. I wish I could find it again. If anybody knows about this radio program, and it was about the 7 wonders of the world, but the new ones. And a man who I think must have come from science or from neurology at that time turned around and said, "Standing up is the most extraordinary event that we can do." And it's and if we think about it, you're balancing on a minute amount of, there's not much that you're balancing on. Sorry, I've got shoes, but there's very little that's in touch with the earth. And if I do this, the counterpoint in the rest of my body is huge. So, because if I didn't counterpoint, I'd fall forward. So, and that's simple. So all I have to do is go this way, and everything else is counterpointed. So in some ways, both this or this are a gesture or a pose or a position which alters the very foundations of everything else that you're doing. So the idea of the everyday and the idea of how we alter our stances and our language in minutiae and all of the orchestration of that, I turn around and go, hell, that's a hugely rich subject. So of course I can't help but be immediately excited and incredibly daunted by it. but a lot of the works in their very different ways in the past few years. Don't want to go through them all, but the films have been mentioned, so all this can happen. Is found footage of photographs and film. The earliest found footage we can find, all documentary, in which the pleasure of photography and early film is announced, because nobody had done this before. So not only can you see the pleasure of the photographer capturing a sort of semi-Victorian woman wandering around in a large hat, and the woman in the large hat going, oh my goodness, I'm going to be re-seen. Mm-hmm. So the idea of everyday movement and the re-seen then suddenly becomes sort of wildly intriguing to me, and that just arrived from the film. So then I think I'm hearing, but you need to double check on me, I'm hearing that a space can be re-seen, materials are rearranged. Sorry, Lauren, I got that in. I just thinking that, actually, unbeknownst, that's the title of our new piece, but that's not what I meant to say. But this is the idea, this whole, what we have at our fingertips, what we have, not the great architect or the great choreographer, what we have in common, and the richness and the diversity and the pleasure in reorganizing that. At this moment, I'm just cock a hoop. Then, of course, then I go into the studio tomorrow and I'm terrified because it just seems gigantic. Mm-hmm. But in those senses, that's the everyday, I think, gives us, it's great food.
I mean, there's a link I'm making, and you can go on your own link. But just about materials being rearranged, it sounds like the language of sustainability, in a sense.
Yes.
Of the kind of rearranging or the change, but not from new or not from scratch necessarily, but a kind of a cycle of materiality that has its own momentum. Is that?
Yeah,
it's something that I'm thinking, and this, back to the building, it's a building that couldn't have been made from scratch. Could you have built this as an architectural question, maybe, for the LFA? Could you have conceived together of building a studio from scratch, or was it the relationship with the rearrangement of this space that mattered?
I think the existing building was an incredibly powerful driver for this building, and it really, really enriched it. I mean, these two projects that we did for Sue before we got to this one, there was one which I think was very powerful and kind of important in its reiteration through this piece of work. But and that was an idea about how two ideas actually. The first one was, what is it like to be in a world where you're in contact with the city, but from an elevated position? Because the studio is on the roof, and so was it in an earlier iteration. And it's that thing of, you're there, but you're withdrawn. So you've contact with the world outside, and you register it, and the forms of the structure and surfaces register it, but actually you're still withdrawn and you're focused around the thing you're trying to do. So, what's that relationship with the city? And the second one was coming into a space which was definitely like a kind of undercroft, where you sense the presence of something above your head, which was where your destination lay. And that was really an early idea in a project like 2 iterations ago, and it kind of re-emerged in this project, but it re-emerged with great richness because of the kind of parameters and restrictions perhaps that are offered, but also the resonances that are offered by the presence of school, Southwark, the programme, the materiality of it, all the kind of the stuff, of the architecture itself. So the muscularity of the brickwork, the delicacy of the rear. I mean, lots and lots of things sort of speaking about that tension. And
just earlier we were talking about memory and that the fact that the building holds memory. And I didn't realise how important that was until a little bit later when I'd sort of settled here. And the memory of the stairs is if you go down,
In
if
the
those that
foyer.
don't know the building, there's a memory of stairs. They're just cut off, and for somebody working with the body, there's memory in my body. There's scarring, there's age, there's reiteration, there's having to redefine oneself, and then this building is a living sense of redefining itself, but in a different age. So those somehow. I wish I could capture this more, but it somehow makes the whole thing more human. It makes the whole thing have a scale that I believe anybody coming in here understands, and I think that matters to us hugely, particularly in comparison with some architectural events now, which for me belittle the human scale. You know, they may be doing wonderful other things, but dealing with human scale is not one of them. And but in an arts context, the dialogue between whoever comes to visit and the thing that they are going to visit, that's the most important dialogue that you can iterate.
I mean, for me, there's a lot of richness in the existing architecture here. For example, and I think the body is actually interesting its relation with that. I mean, a lot of architecture I find not very sensual, or it's sensual in a kind of rather intellectual way. And I think one of the things I'm quite interested in is the viscerality of architecture, the sort of the tactility and the sensuality of it. And I think, you know, I think there are aspects of this which are quite sort of brutish, and perhaps the kind of thick brick walls are one of those, and then you've got the kind of glazed bricks which are also quite repulsive, as it were. But then you've got, you know, render, which has got this horsehair and it's very sort of crumbly.
You've got flabby bits.
You've got flabby bits, exactly. Bits which sort
Say
of
more, what
sag.
are those?
Sarah turned around, we were talking,
Yeah.
we had adjectives, about 6 o'clock we were going through our adjectives, and she said, oh, there's a bit that's flabby.
There are several flabby bits, yeah.
I
And,
love that.
And I really like that. I mean, I think a lot of architecture is sort of very taut and a bit uptight, and, you know, I think we're quite interested in the bits that sort of maybe hang out or that aren't trying to do that. And that have a certain kind of sensuality to them. But yeah, but I think, I mean, there are other ways in which, I mean, talking about that staircase I think is interesting because most brick buildings, a brick is a kind of module, you know, it's an easy module to make buildings out of because it's the size of a man's hand. And laying a brick day after day, it's a repetitive movement, so it's got to be comfortable and it's got to be easy and you've got to be able to do it quickly. So immediately you've got the body inscribed within the scale of a wall. And when we were thinking about, and the staircase also is a kind of gauge, isn't it, of verticality. You know, it's how you pace up a vertical dimension through the body itself, through a step. And then when we were thinking about remaking the staircase, you know, that's all about sort of tension and sort of the sinews and so forth. So it describes the idea of holding a kind of position, but in a very different way. So scaling it through a kind of rod and a sort of, like a plumb, actually, a plumb line, as opposed to
It's never
something
static.
which is built.
No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway.
And it's hanging, you know,
Yes,
which is
it's hung.
principally a hanging,
actually hung
which is
from the ceiling.
extraordinary for a dance and a choreographic repeating acts. So many symbols in the building for us to remind ourselves of what we are and what we do.
I mean, we've got about 25 minutes left, and I want to open up for a conversation with all of you to ask questions and to engage in a conversation. But I might ask one more, which is if we're thinking of this, there was the making of, there's the building, and there's been the life of this building for 10 years, and a longer conversation between the two of you, and I know between yourselves and others at various intersections across the arts. So we can speak about this space, but let's perhaps use this space to think about a space.
Yeah.
What are the qualities or what are important for a space of possibility? We've mentioned scale, memory. We've mentioned movement, rhythm,
Touch.
sensuality, domestic feel, the body.
Sound.
Sound. Say more.
Hugely important, because I've in the past rehearsed in so many different spaces, and the horror of spending 10 hours speaking, sorry, I'm not going to do this, but you get the gist, in which you're, where, okay, hold on. Where are the balances in our communication? So if one is even in an office surrounding or wherever else, there are moments in which you need to be able to speak and gesture quietly, and there are moments when you might need to be more amplified. But to be able to have that nuance within one room gives you that range of expression. If one of them is dominating because you can't be heard, everything else slightly falls away. So how one hears and how one sees with light is terrifically important in this space. So how one hears and how one sees and how one touches. So basically the senses that we were born with are the ones that I think we need to use.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a complex world, isn't it? Like, I think I was going to say light actually before you said that, because I think that I mean, obviously you can't register space without light, and also I don't know what it is, but I think we're all drawn to light, and through light you have this sense of orientation. You know what the weather's doing, you know what time of day it is, you know, you really get in touch with what is going on out there, but it's also the shaping and the contouring of the place that you're in, and I think that's very evident in this when there's sort of, when it's well lit. It's not very well, you know, daylit at the moment, and actually playing with that and trying to sort of orchestrate the way that you're trying to help people navigate the building and understand where they are, and feel comfortable, not feel comfortable, whatever it is. Light's the thing that you're using all the time. So, for example, sticking the staircase at the rear of the building, you know, we did that because we're trying to preserve this as a footprint, but in order to get you there, you've got to be pulled all the way through the building. And so light is the mechanism that you're being drawn towards, and that's why that's the light wall at the back. You're not, you know, you don't have to say that or make it kind of, you know, in your face, but that's actually what's happening. And then when in this room, these are what's giving you, and the windows, they're blacked out at the moment, but if you can see out the windows, they're what's giving you the eye contact with the world outside. But the sky is lighting this, this floor through these spandrel panels, and they're not transparent, they're only translucent, and that is to make this, this light much more sort of, well, less sharp, you know, to soften it and not get a deep shadow. So there's a lot of things sort of going on which are helping us to understand what this space is about. But, and the lights are absolutely critical.
You said one word that I know we both spoke about earlier, which is play. So how does a building give you a sense of play? And then the light gives you a sense of time.
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't know about you, but to exist in a room that doesn't remain all the same all day with electric light or fluorescent light or whatever else, but to know that time is passing, to know that the day is changing, to know all of those things, and then to be able to be playful in the building, and that, or in a street, or in a square, or in another space. It's, you know, what do you want to be? What do you want to be as a person?
Yeah, exactly.
Really, what you want to be as a person is roughly what you want your building to have the capacity for, to be in conversation with.
Yeah, I think play is a good word.
I think play's a great word.
Play is a really good word because it, I mean, one of the things I like about architecture is that it kind of invites you to be naughty, you know. It's sort of always
Does it
testing.
do it enough?
No, most architecture doesn't do it enough, but I think it's sort of testing the boundaries all the time and getting you to think. And I think that, you know, I think the best architecture really, it works at all levels, you know, physically and mentally, and it's making you think about the way your behavior is conditioned and you know, how you're invited to respond to what's going on around you. And through the way that you use it, or behaving, you know, you're remaking space all the time. And that's really interesting. It's always dynamic and never the same.
So it's a conversation itself, in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you made me think, what if the outsides of this cityscape were a bit more along the lines of what we've been speaking about tonight?
If only.
In terms of scale and gesture and light and sound and the thoughtfulness.
And playful.
And playfulness, of these kind of sites. I wanted to maybe open up to the audience and first maybe see who's in the room. Are there dancers in the room? If you show hands, are there? It is very interesting.
A band.
That would be a phenomenal.
Reluctant dancers.
Reluctant dancers. I mean, all of us have danced at some point, I'm sure, but that's a different question. And architects, are there people who?
There's a few.
Formal architects, a few. Again, very reluctant. Okay, and many others, which is perhaps going to give us an interesting conversation. So, are there any questions at this time for Sarah and Siobhan? Yeah.
Oh, it's working, yeah.
Hi, I've got an observation and a question for each of you. One was that the what I think are the electrics rising up in the arches seem to have an echo of the original metal trusses on the roof, and the beams at the top. It's like taking one up onto the wooden, from the metal to the wooden, and then coming back the other way. So that was an observation, but I wondered whether actually using the metal to channel practical energy, electricity, was something of sort of up and down to the ground, and across had some playful effect with the other axis, which is the one that you would get in a sort of conventional church or chapel with an archway or that way, and there's this sort of playing with those energies, both practically but also in a kind of physical way.
It's a great question. I mean, it's a question about, not just about the form, but about what it's doing, the currents of energy.
And exposing that.
Yeah.
You know, having it as an exposed visual kind of reference.
Is this a neat thought? Is this interesting?
It's really, I've never thought about it in that way before, but now you've said it, I can see exactly what you mean.
Right.
I mean, really, actually our firm didn't design this lighting, but we did design the spaces that hold this power cabling and everything. And it is interesting the way that it meets in the middle there in a very shallow point, like a kind of Gothic arch or something like that, which is quite funny.
And and holds a symmetry to the kind of rising life on punching out both sides.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you spot that, and it just shows how memory is really important in our reading of space, and you know, the conversation that go through time, actually back a very, very long way.
The other question was for Siobhan, is really, have you seen a difference in the way that people engage in their art practice when they're here because of those, I suppose, thoughtfulness of the way that the building was made and everything? Has it made a difference?
A lovely question. Yes. But I would also like to turn around and go, I think certainly the last 10, but more than that years, dance itself and people who are practicing it in this country have desired more detail and more care, and dance has evolved in different strands in this country, in America and in Europe as well, but in different strands. and an attention to detail is one of those strands. So I believe that was emerging anyhow. But the fact that it was allowed to exist in a place of detail, I think can only be helpful. But recently there have been many necessary dance spaces built. But when I began, we were working in horrific circumstances, if I can say. So, and we were still managing to make work. So I don't want to be romantic about it, but I do want to turn around and go, this art form has benefited hugely from the recognition of architecture in the last few years, and I think it has rewarded architecture by its own emboldening, if that's a word. So the romance of, oh, we're in this space, therefore we can make better work, is, I know, but there's lots of people came up to me and went, it must make so much difference, and I wanted to honour the art form and go, of course it makes a difference, but I think in its own honour, dance was trying to do its very best, but now it can do it in much better circumstances.
I suppose as a practicing artist, if you're forced to shout all the time, there's something that and people then get used to shouting, so they forget to listen to the quieter voices.
Yes.
And they are, for me, just as important as the shouting, or I enjoy the shouting. But so it's very interesting for you to say how important that was for your practice as well.
Hugely important, and I think as an art form we have moved on terrifically for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that there are these places which are welcoming not only to the working artists but to the public, and so suddenly the language of dance is more available, is more talked about, is more present, is more written about, and all of those things, it then adds its dimension into and amongst the other arts, which is why I wanted this building to work, and in amongst social sciences and other sciences. So we are able to take responsibility now for the things we should be responsible for, which is to be far more inclusive and far more in dialogue with many other issues and practices. And I think, what we have here is glorious in making that happen.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah. So, is that actually changing things?
Yes, it is.
Good. Can you speak a little bit about, so there's the dream of the building and then the manifestation of the dream that we're actually sitting in. What sustained you? What helped you believe in making it happen? And how difficult, or wasn't it difficult to do that? And I've just been enjoying hearing your conversation about your collaboration, and I guess there's a little sub-question, which is, was that a big part of it?
Great question.
Hugely part of it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
massive.
One of the best and biggest working relationships, and now a friendship, that I can ever imagine having, because we were both needing to be in each other's circles of knowledge, and because we were refused quite a lot, it was at least 5 years of quite hard work to get nowhere, and then something happened. So it may be a bit like labour, giving birth. You don't remember necessarily all the pain, but if I think about it, there must have been tremendously bleak times. But by the time it got to 5 years, I feel we were bonded, not only as individuals, but our teams. And our teams of people had been, our board, your team, had been knitted together to make this happen. And we were refused again when we found this building. when I say refused, I don't mean to be negative about them by the lottery. The lottery had masses to do. And I hope they don't mind me saying this, but I think I rang them up, the man who turned around and said, "I'm awfully sorry, Sue." It just slipped below the yes factor. And I rang them up and said, it's all right, I get it. You know, I get that we're small. No single artist or double artist had received a lottery fund at that point. So I could sort of say, listen, you know, I sort of understand. But I can't ring up Southwark and say, who've held on to this building, and say we haven't got the money. I've asked them to wait for 2 years. And he went, okay, all right, you know, well, maybe we'll phone them. And I went, okay, because I just haven't got the courage. Half an hour later, why don't you come in tomorrow morning? So I don't want to turn around and go the correlation of, I didn't want to say they're not brave or whatever else, but I have a feeling they heard something about, this is zone 1, I think it is, or I think I said to them, this is zone 1. We have an arts building. We have the potential of an arts building. We have Southwark, who were really keen on us being there. We have everything in place. I don't have the courage to say no to all of these people anymore. And I maybe they just heard that, or maybe something had slipped through, and they turned around and said, "I'll come in tomorrow morning," and we did. And then it was still complicated. I'll let Sarah talk more, but you can talk. You know, we can both talk about complications.
We can talk about that for a long time.
The complications and what sustained through it all.
Well, relationships, I think, are
I
very,
think
very
relationships.
important. I mean, we've
Obstinacy.
built an amazing, yeah, you've got to be quite determined. Yeah, you can't. I mean, I think that's a really good lesson for anybody who wants to get something done. You know, just don't take no for an answer. Just keep going, because it is going to be difficult. I mean, all building is difficult, but I mean, I think the stakes were very high for Sue. I mean, when I first met you, Sue's company was tiny. You often met in your kitchen, but had a tiny little rented space. And when we were researching, you know, what is it like to kind of work, to be Sue's company and work every day in a studio? And we were going to Mary Ward, and we were going to the German Gymnasium, which is now this posh German restaurant at King's Cross, right? Yeah. And they had a splintery floor, and the roof was leaking, and it was in midwinter, and everyone was dancing in their overcoats, and there were buckets all over the floor. And I walked in and I thought, my God, I can't believe that this company is doing what they're doing in these circumstances. This is absolutely appalling. And when Sue, you know, knocked on the door of the lottery and said, you know what, this isn't good. This is not acceptable for a company of our standing. And I want to stand for independent dance, to say we deserve better. Actually, it's quite hard to say no when you know that that's what's going on. And we were trying to help her to do that. And it's been a very interesting process, sort of seeing the company go through these 2 rejections, learning from that, putting the right team together, getting the board in place, you know, getting savvy about what you need to do and what you didn't need to do, and all of that, and just chipping away at the old block until it gives way, you know. And actually this building was, I think, really, really cheap. You know, it's £2.4 million.
4.2.
No, the building was.
Oh, the building was
2.4.
The whole thing was
4.2. Which, if you know, I mean, okay, it was 10 years ago, but it was still an incredible bargain, you know.
And on time.
People worked so hard to achieve that. So, I mean, it is really money well spent, you know.
I think Sarah touched on a point. I could not bear seeing dancers who I 100% believed in rehearsing in hats and gloves. I mean, I just couldn't. I just thought, and I had, you know, I'd won the odd award, and I'm going, what the hell's, you know, how can I stand up and, you know, go up there and get the thingy, and then go back and watch people in hats and gloves and steam coming out and a baby in a carrier there, because that's the baby arrived, not mine, somebody else's. Yeah. And you're tearing your hair out, and then that gives you so much energy. I can't do that anymore. It's not right. But having said that, the lottery were extraordinary. They sent us a woman, oh my God, her name's just gone. It was just there a moment ago, who was so ferocious with us, so terrifying and so wonderful. Because if she hadn't been ferocious and terrifying, we would have, we were less adept than the Royal Opera House and the whatever else. We didn't know. And she just took us through it step by step, going, nope, back again, and nope, back again. And if she hadn't done it, and she was here at the 10-year anniversary, and I couldn't have been more proud.
You can't underestimate how difficult it is for somebody who, they make dance, they're not in the building world. They don't know how to do any of this stuff, We at least have some inkling of what's out there, things await. But, Sue has brought her company from being this sort of kitchen sink affair to being this amazing organisation, and the building is part of that growth. It's hard to sort of imagine, I think, what you were like at that stage and what transformation has been undergone by the company in the process, and sort of grown up and matured and sort of embraced lots of other things. And actually, the biggest compliment to us as designers has changed their art practice as a result of having this thing. If that's
Absolutely.
not being, then nothing is.
I think, sorry, just very quickly, it was a tiny bit, is possibly this is an indication that when an art form or art forms or science or whatever else, if somebody can say yes to their potential, how much else that produces, how many more people that includes. Sorry, I wanted.
No, I was just wanting to reflect back what you said. That's what was really great, I think. You said, I can't do this anymore.
No.
And that sounds like a sentence which is, I can't do this anymore. Oh my God, it's too much.
No, it was, I can't do
I can't do this anymore.
Was,
I have to do this.
exactly, yeah.
There's a yes in there.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You don't often
It's
get
turning it
you
round.
can
Yeah.
feel helpless and not get
Exactly.
We're sitting here. Yes to that frustration.
Yeah.
Yeah. Born out of it, yeah, definitely.
Last year I was a volunteer here for Open House, which is a weekend where the general public let loose.
Good.
And they love it as well. They think it's sort of more organic. They sit and take pictures, they meditate or whatever. They ask difficult questions like, what is a sprung floor? Why do you not have mirrors like a ballet studio? What's behind there?
The shard. Oh yeah, well, yeah, behind there, yes.
So I think what made it special, perhaps made the building sort of iconic, is you required people to take their shoes off up there. And I thought that was just to protect the floor, but I think there was something wider going on, perhaps, that you were making people feel slightly out of their comfort zone. But when you started, did you have any concept that this would have a wider appeal to the people who weren't dancers? Or is that something that's perhaps happened in retrospect?
I don't think I was fully cooked enough coming in here. I felt I had all that urgency and all the energy that came with trying to turn around and go, the people who make dance happen, apart from the audience, are the people who perform it, and that I was letting them down, or we were letting them down. That galvanizing energy was such a dynamic that it filled me completely. But when we entered into this studio just before Christmas, 2005, the Christmas before, thank you. And I think I came back and forward through the door that day, and every time I came back in, something was happening to me, whereby people were ringing me up going, oh my God, you've got a home. And that word worried me, because I thought home is where I close the door. Home is where I have a hearth. Home is where I kick my shoes off, in a way. I thought, no, this should have energy running through it. Energy made it. It should have energy and change running through it. And if it has that, then we need people who can bring that change. And it can't only be us in our own world that brings change. It has to be people from other worlds bringing in change. And I want, at that point, I didn't quite understand how Elephant and Castle, which we knew was about to undergo change, but I didn't really know what it was and how it functioned and how I could play. I was slightly nervous. I just thought this thing has arrived, a bit like TARDIS, and then what kind of relationships can we build up? And we have, that means we're porous, and that makes a huge difference. So it's not only a structure, but it's got porosity in it, I think, for engagement. Sorry. Yeah.
We have a question here. We have a question here. Are there any others? We can take the last few.
I have one.
You have one? Great. So we'll take these two and then...
My question is more about the choreographic work. When you moved in here, did you notice, because the building is obviously, it has a real identity and it's very curved, did you notice almost a change in the way you choreographed or what you ended up producing? Did the building have a reflection on that? Did you take things from the building to bring into it? Or did it relatively stay the same as what it was?
No, it didn't stay the same, but I think I was in a period of change anyhow. Somewhere in this mix, I had brought myself up to perform and make work for the stage, for big stages like Sadler's Wells. And I had gone through, I'm not very good at 30 years or something like that, doing that, and really benefiting and really getting to grips with, or trying at least, attempting to get to grips about what it's like to be on a stage and to communicate from a stage out to a large audience. And there's a real sense of knowledge that you're trying to grasp. But I had a problem. When I made work in studios, even if they were damp and holy ones, I would see the nuances of thinking as the dancers practiced from one idea and movement into another. And I loved that, and they loved that, and there was a fineness as well as a very real communication. So I was making work with more and more of that detail in it. But when I went to sit in the auditorium and watched that, while thinking I was dealing with the heft of the stage, I could not see that detail. And I missed it so much, and I felt we were making a form of cinema, not a form of materials and thought and feeling, and can one bring the idea of memory or anticipation or rhythm or dynamic in a quite fine way. So it all happened all at once. I come in here, I'm in that state of change, I'm in this studio, I'm seeing Henry and Deborah and Jill, exquisite artists really working at a detail that I am flummoxed by. Yet again, I have to go, I've got to change because these artists are showing me something that is incredibly important to me. So then we move from the theatre and we go into gallery spaces or other spaces. For other reasons as well, but primarily because I could re-understand, or I had evolved, or we had evolved, or dance had evolved, all of those things into being able to make something with a kind of accuracy about human being and behavior that I can't leave.
And what if we asked the same question to you, but the opposite? After building this building and working through the kind of interdisciplinary relationship and learning from Sue and her practice and her collaborators, did that change the way you approached architecture and building?
We decided to simplify. No, that's a lie.
Lesson is learned.
No, I think I don't know how it changed.
Had you built the house before or during?
Yeah, I did. I think one of the really precious things about this project, which has been quite difficult to recapture in others, but which I feel we're very, very committed to, is collaboration, is actually, trying to find what is it that this building that you're trying to design for this person is going to contribute to making what they do or the way they see themselves or what it can facilitate in their life is going to make life better. And actually the only way to do that is to get very, very heavily involved and collaborate. And it happens all too infrequently. And I still think that this, our collaboration on this project is sort of exemplary in my career because, maybe it's two females, roughly the same age, both ambitious for what they're doing, etc., and just something gelling. But also, Sue, your ability to articulate very deep things about what you're trying to do here, which a lot of people find difficult to do because they don't examine themselves so deeply. So that's a privilege to be working with somebody who's able to kind of have that conversation. And then to keep going, to not let go and to keep making more and more demands, which were sometimes very frustrating and hard work, I have to say. But, you just grabbed it and you were not going to let it go until it was perfect. And actually that makes you raise your game and, really puts you up to responding in the best way that you know how. And sometimes that was very, very difficult and challenging, but actually I think ultimately it created the most amazing thing.
But that's very funny because I used to think of Sarah as the perfectionist, and I used to get quite frightened of her. And I'm, go well. So that's very, very funny. We both obviously goaded each other because I used to, find her go, I don't think I can say that to Sarah because it's not going to.
Oh well, maybe we're perfectionists about different things.
Probably.
That's good. We've got it all covered.
Thanks. Me starting and finishing. I don't normally try and, control these situations quite so much. But I'm just curious, 10 years on, maybe 10 minutes on, as soon as people walked in the door, but what were the biggest surprises in terms of the way that people use the building, what worked and didn't work?
That's interesting.
You imagine something, you imagine people are going to do a certain thing or respond in a certain way. What's the difference between that and reality?
God, I
don't know. A lot of the artwork that's come in, because I don't, even that first year, I knew I wanted other things to come in, but I didn't feel sophisticated about it at all. And we started quite slowly with asking artists, local artists to begin with, to come and bring their work in. And then over the years, that program has become so richly articulated and sometimes so amusing. I mean, some works that have come in here have just been, there was Ali, I might need help. It's not, who projected the world on the loo? Stephen Pippin. So you'd go into the loo and you'd have a pee with the world being, and of course it was amazing because he's roughly turning around and making a comment about how we're treating the world. But you'd have to go in every day, and of course I liked going into that loo. But so you'd get other people's perspectives being both amused and challenging and shocking, and then these are apocryphal, but they just make me laugh. There was Ali, when you can't go. You're my memory stick. Who was the famous punk artist that came in here? Blix. Anybody heard of Blix Bargeld? Okay, he performed here. Now, if I speak to the right people, they all go, no, he did not. And I try and look cool. Damn impossible, because Blix Bargeld performed here. There were queues out to St. George's Square because this major punk rock artist performed here. The audience, you couldn't move up here, totally in black, and they never came back again. So all that idea of building up audiences and all of that stuff was sort of, it sort of went out the window. But of course, it was one of the most amazing evenings you could have, and that I would have never have imagined things like that. And I hope those kinds of things turn up in all their glory again. And damn the bloody capturing of, audience number. Sorry, Erin. Because there are moments in which life takes over and human activity takes over, and the whole thing goes pear-shaped. And it's just wonderful. But I would like you to come back again.
I think on that note, and on the reminder of this building's porosity, its playfulness, its invitation, thank you for inviting us here into the building for this week and sharing your making of the Siobhan Davies. And thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful conversation. So can we give a hand for Sarah?